Hey, and welcome. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. Got a big hour planned for you. So, this hour, because we're now 5 days from the election, I'm going to make the case for President Trump along the lines of his policies. We're going to talk about all the things that Trump has done, because I understand all the media want to talk about is all the dumb stuff Trump tweets. I get it. I mean, it's easy media coverage. As a member of the media, the easiest story that you can write on any given day is the story where Trump tweeted something dumb. And then you have that be the entire news cycle for the entire day. And you ask all Republicans about what Trump said. And then you're like, oh, isn't he a racist? And everybody says, no, he's not a racist. Or I haven't seen that tweet. And this is the easiest job in the media. The hard job in the media is actually digging down into the stuff that is actually happening on the presidential level. Because the fact is the Trump administration's record has been wildly successful. I mean, extremely successful on domestic policy, on foreign policy, on regulatory policy, on economic policy. When it comes to this administration, there has never been a bigger divide in American history between the rhetoric of an administration and the actual activities of the administration. Now, that doesn't mean that all of Trump's rhetoric is bad. I've criticized Trump's rhetoric when I thought it was bad. I criticized him over his original comments at Charlottesville, which I thought were wildly insufficient. I've criticized Trump on his comments about Mexican judges or about where Ilhan Omar comes from and that sort of stuff. But here is the reality. Trump has also expressed opposition to some of the most nefarious forces in American life, from the 1619 Project to the multiculturalist attempt to treat all cultures as uniquely deserving of praise. And not all of Trump's rhetoric has been bad. Some of it has been very bad. Much of it has been very good, and in some cases, uniquely good. So this hour, we are going to go through all of Trump's accomplishments, ranging from the ideological to the actual practical. Because I think that, again, the easiest thing is to focus in on the personality of the candidate. That is the easiest thing in the world to do. It is a lazy trick. Okay, it is a lazy trick to simply look at two candidates and say, which one would I rather have a beer with? Or which one do I think is nicer? Or which one would make a better grandpa? Like, none of that is relevant to the question of which direction should the country go in terms of policy and ideology and philosophy. You can come down on any side of these questions, but you should at least be fully informed, and your friends and family should be fully informed of what exactly the Trump administration has done. Because my guess is they like a lot of the things he has done. They just don't want to acknowledge it. Okay, so let's start with President Trump and his domestic policy. We'll get to foreign policy in a little bit. So on domestic policy, Trump has been wildly successful. His economic record is virtually unparalleled for the last half century. So there's been a lot of talk about more jobs being created under Obama. Okay, but there were many more people on the sidelines under Obama. It turns out that one of the hardest things to do in a labor market is to take a labor market that is gradually moving and then move it that additional margin up to wild success. And that is what Trump has actually done. Wages were rising faster under Trump in 3 years than they did for 8 under Obama. Most of those gains in terms of wage increases were actually happening disproportionately at the bottom half of the scale. Okay, the fact is that Americans were doing unprecedentedly well under Donald Trump's economy until COVID hit. And the reason for that is obvious. Donald Trump cut taxes. Donald Trump cut regulations. Donald Trump created an environment where people felt safe and secure investing in their workers, investing in their business. There was a lot of money, trillions of dollars, sitting on the sidelines during the Obama administration because you just didn't know what confiscatory policy Obama was going to pursue at any given moment. Was it worth hiring somebody only to have your taxes increased next month? Was it worth staffing up only in order to have to fire half of those people when the economy downturned? Was it worth investing in marketing, knowing that the market could go soft in any moment because Barack Obama's policy was so variable and so generally anti-business? Under Barack Obama, we had the slowest recovery in the history of the United States. Under Donald Trump, the economy continued to accelerate and accelerated much faster under Trump than it did under Obama. This is true in terms of wages, particularly. It is true in terms of living standards. It is true in terms of the unemployment rate under Barack Obama was significantly higher on average than it was under Donald Trump. By the time of the election, by the time of COVID, we had the lowest unemployment rate for the last 50 years. So yes, Donald Trump's economic record is excellent. His economic record was really, really, really good up until COVID hit. What you'll see is a bunch of people attempting to downplay Trump's economy. But that is really wrongheaded. Everybody who runs a business knows there is a difference between operating in the Trump era and operating in the Obama era. And you could see that, right? Until 2020, Trump's first term was characterized by solid job growth, right? This is something that CNN acknowledges. Hilariously, they say at this point in Obama's presidency, the job market was up 0.4%. Okay, well, he took office at a time when we were at the bottom of the recession. Donald Trump escalated the employment in the country at a time when we were already escalating employment, which is actually a harder thing to do. Median income under Donald Trump rose tremendously. Median income under Donald Trump rose 9.2% under Donald Trump. That's the median income data until 2019. Under Barack Obama, over the course of his entire presidency, it rose 5%. Okay, that is absolutely true. That means median income, median American household income, was up $5,800 from 2016 after adjusting for inflation. And the pandemic obviously took the wind out of the sails, but that is the reason. The economy, by the way, is recovering this quarter. We had a 33% GDP growth this quarter. Why? Because people understand that the underlying fundamentals of the economy are still strong. It's just that COVID meant that everybody had to stay home. The stock market under Donald Trump continued to rise incredibly steadily. Okay, Trump's economy was historically good. Historically good. And there's no other way to cut it. Manufacturing jobs under Donald Trump increased. A gross domestic product under Donald Trump increased at a significantly faster rate, like wildly outpacing Barack Obama in the early years of his term. Okay, so all of the talk about Trump's economy not being all that good, it was really, really good up until March, obviously. And one of the reasons for that is because he did radically cut regulation. Diane Katz, writing for the Heritage Foundation back in 2018, October 17th, 2018, about 2 years ago, writes, the Trump administration on Wednesday reported $23 billion in savings from 176 deregulatory actions in fiscal year 2018. Even more consequential, the administration has issued 65% fewer significant rules, those with costs that exceed $100 million a year, than the Obama administration, 51% fewer than the Bush administration after 22 months in office. Naomi Rao, who's an administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, now she is a judge on one of the circuit courts. She said, in modern times, the expansion of the administrative state has placed undue burdens on the public, impeding economic growth, technological innovation, and consumer choice. Our reform efforts emphasize the rule of law, respect for the Constitution's separation of powers, and the limits of agency authority. This all resulted in fewer man-hours being spent complying with regulations, which means more man-hours spent on actual productive activity. The administration in 2018 took 57 significant deregulatory actions compared to 14 significant regulatory actions, according to the Information and Regulatory Affairs Office data. That is a massive change. In the number of costly regulations after 22 months in office, under Barack Obama, 647 costly regulations. Under Trump, 229 costly regulations. Annual regulatory costs under the Obama administration increased by $122 billion, by the way. The administration capped its regulatory costs at $18 billion. So the cuts in regulations radically increased the possibilities for American businesses. And those cuts in regulatory action included allowing small businesses and sole proprietors to join together as associations to purchase healthcare coverage for employees, which was a cost-saving measure prohibited under Obamacare, reducing red tape for skilled nursing facilities, hospitals, and home healthcare providers, streamlining approval for applications for fracking, expanding exemptions to the Obamacare contraceptive coverage mandate for religious beliefs. Right? All this stuff was really, really good stuff. Cutting regulations is a radically underestimated part of the Trump record that was really, really good. Another part of the Trump record that was really, really good were the tax cuts. The tax cuts cut taxes for people across the board, which is why now Joe Biden, when he says he's going to repeal the Trump tax cuts, he finally admitted he means he's only going to repeal part of the Trump tax cuts, because it turns out that those Trump tax cuts helped pretty much everybody on the income spectrum. So long as you are making an income and paying income tax in the United States, an income tax cut under President Trump's tax plan helped you. In fact, the only people it tended to hurt were high income earners in blue states, people like me when I was living in California. Here was President Trump announcing the tax cuts.
$3.2 trillion in tax cuts for American families, including the doubling of the standard deduction and the doubling of the child tax credit. The typical family of four earning $75,000, we see an income tax cut of more than $2,000. Many much higher than that, slashing their tax bill in half. And they're going to start to see that because we're signing today. They're going to start to see that in February.
And this all contributed again to average hourly earnings rising fairly dramatically under Donald Trump, like much more dramatically under Donald Trump than they did under Barack Obama. The poverty rate as of 2019 was at an all-time low in the United States. About 4.2 million fewer people were living in poverty in the United States in 2019 compared to 2018. Okay, that is a major, again, these tax cuts, which were supposedly just for the rich people, they weren't just for the rich people. They really, really helped the economy. Cut regulation, cut taxes. Okay, and then he obviously used his presidential power to appoint originalist judges to the best of his ability. I mean, like hundreds and hundreds of them. This is largely to the credit of Mitch McConnell and the Federalist Society advisors who put together the list on behalf of President Trump. In the middle, by the middle of 2020, by the middle of this year, by June, the Senate had confirmed Trump's 200th judicial nominee. McConnell noted that in addition to being Trump's 200th judicial nominee, there were no more vacancies on the country's influential appeals courts. So all of these vacancies have been filled by Trump and a Republican Senate. Senator Chuck Grassley, the former chairman and current member of the Judiciary Committee, added he expected Trump's nominees to be in the mold of the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. He said this landmark achievement is the result of the president keeping his word and the unwavering determination of Leader McConnell, Chairman Graham, that'd be Lindsey Graham of the Judiciary Committee, and our conference. Republicans have set a record pace, according to The Hill, at confirming Trump's appeals court nominees, including breaking a record for the number of picks confirmed during an administration's first and second year in office. And again, the reason for this is because Harry Reid nuked the filibuster on judicial nominees, claiming that it was necessary in order to get through Obama's nominees. Trump has filled an enormous number of judicial positions with people who actually give a damn about the Constitution, which is a radical difference from Obama judges. Obama judges typically believe that they get to look into their own hearts and their own souls and decide what the law is based on what they wish the law were. Trump's judges generally do not do this. And of course, this is most obvious when it comes to his Supreme Court picks. Despite disappointments with Neil Gorsuch with regard to his interpretation of the Civil Rights Act and his attempt to read transgenderism into the Title IX provisions of the Civil Rights Act, which is bizarre, Gorsuch overall is still a textualist. Justice Kavanaugh is still a textualist. Amy Coney Barrett looks to be an originalist. Okay, these are all significantly better than if Hillary Clinton had been president. Here was President Trump announcing the various justices that he had picked for the Supreme Court. Just as a reminder, this was a major thing.
Today, I am keeping another promise to the American people by nominating Judge Neil Gorsuch. So was that a surprise? Was it? Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Judge Amy Coney Barrett.
Okay, each one of these justices has expressed their fealty to the text of the Constitution, to the original meaning of the Constitution. They've expressed their fealty to the belief that the judiciary is not supposed to be a branch of government that, quote unquote, does policy. It is a branch of government that interprets the law as written. Doesn't mean they'll always get it right. It means they're going to do a hell of a lot better than the Democrats would have appointed. Democrats appointees generally do not care about the law as written. They care much more when it comes to the Constitution about something very different. They care much more about the political priorities of Democrats, which is why Ruth Bader Ginsburg could be counted on in any pinch to do the work of whatever Democratic president was in office. We are going through President Trump's policy successes this entire hour. So we've been going through his domestic policy successes. We have talked about his cuts to regulations. We've talked about his appointment of hundreds of judges to the federal judiciary. We've talked about his tax cuts, which jogged the economy. Well, it didn't stop there. President Trump has also appointed pro-life people to the executive branch, and he's pursued pro-life policy. So, for example, he reinstated the Mexico City policy to prevent taxpayer funding of abortions overseas. He signed an executive order stating that faith-based employers and organizations like Little Sisters of the Poor could not be forced to violate religious beliefs to comply with Obamacare. Remember, the Obama administration literally sued nuns in order to get them to cover contraceptive care. Remember this. Trump undid that. He implemented new rules to prevent Title X family planning groups from getting funding federally for abortion. He called on Congress to pass a ban on late-term abortions. He insisted that faith-based entities be included in the CARES Act Paycheck Protection Program, be eligible for funding, so like churches would not go under during the COVID crisis. And he's defended various religious people from having their religious beliefs violated when states attempted to go after them for failures to abide by the social strictures that the left prefers. Okay, all of that is really, really important stuff. All of that would be undone under Biden. Joe Biden does not care about religious freedom, not in any real way, shape, or form. Joe Biden is much more focused on the social left agenda and cramming it down on everybody who engages in business and happens to be religious. Okay, also, importantly, he restored due process on college campuses. So Title IX restrictions had been used to basically suggest that colleges were allowed to run these kangaroo courts where if somebody was accused of sexual assault or sexual harassment on a college campus, you couldn't defend yourself. There were these star chamber courts where essentially you're accused of something. You don't get to confront the accuser. You don't really get to testify on your own behalf in many cases. You don't get the evidence produced against you. And the standard of proof is basically nil. And you can get kicked out of school. Anybody can allege anything. It was really, really horrible. Under the Barack Obama administration, that was redone. Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, the Department of Education, they redid the way the due process is performed on college campuses under Title IX. Here is Betsy DeVos announcing that change.
Justice without fairness is no justice at all. So the way to a better Title IX justice process is not to undermine rights, but to uphold them. The way to a better process is not to reform it, but to replace it. The way to put an end to the crisis of confidence on too many campuses is to rediscover the fundamentals of our founding on which our framers staked their futures for the sake of ours.
Okay, that, of course, is exactly right. She was ripped up and down for this. It was a gutsy decision by Betsy DeVos and the Department of Education, but a very, very important one, because the left has basically suggested that if you want due process, this means that you're speaking up on behalf of toxic masculinity. That is not right. Due process, everyone is entitled to it. I know a lot of folks on the left don't necessarily believe that. They believe that cops should immediately be hauled before courts for the evil of having done their jobs in many cases. They believe that if you are Justice Brett Kavanaugh, being slandered with allegations of gang rape should be enough to bar you from the federal bench. But the Trump administration has pushed hard for due process. Speaking of policing, the Trump administration has been very supportive of police across the country, unlike the Obama administration, which crammed down ridiculous consent decrees that achieved nothing and actually increased crime rates in major cities across the country. The Trump administration has done no such thing. The Trump administration has stood by police as well they should. We'll get to sort of ideological differences between the Trump administration and the Obama administration in just a second. Then we get to what I think may be actually the most important accomplishment of the Trump administration. And I know that Trump has been bashed to hell and back over his COVID response. The reality is, no one on the left can explain what they would have done differently. Really, no one. All they say is wear masks a lot. Okay, the masking data is mixed. Mask mandates have not prevented massive increases in caseload all across Europe. They have not stopped increased caseload in places like France or Germany or Italy or virtually any place else. That does not mean that masking isn't useful in certain particular situations. You're in close contact with someone for 20 minutes. That person is vulnerable. Then it's useful. Okay, but that is really the only thing that Democrats can hang their mask on, so to speak. Their COVID response has been entirely in favor of lockdowns, which are bad and have now been condemned by the WHO. They say they will push vaccines, but it was Trump that created Operation Warp Speed, and it's Democrats who are now saying that they won't approve any vaccine approved by Trump. It was Trump who got the PPE and the ventilators where they needed to go. The most important accomplishment that Trump made during COVID, though, was that he refused to take control via the federal government of every aspect of Americans' life. You know, if a Democrat were in charge, we would have been talking about national lockdowns. You know, if a Democrat were in charge, they would have used every ability at their disposal in order to seize control of private means of production. There was a call to do that through the Defense Production Act. Trump refused it. He said these companies are working with us. There's no reason that we need to seize control of these companies. He was right. The fact that Trump's first response to the single greatest opportunity for a government power grab of my lifetime was not to make that power grab is a great indicator he is not quite the fascist or tyrant that the left likes to make him out to be. The left would have grabbed power in a heartbeat. They have. In California, in New York, in New Jersey. Trump didn't do that. And for that, he deserves enormous credit because he was getting extraordinary blowback. And the easiest thing in the world would have been for him to say, okay, you guys want me to take control? I'm taking control. He didn't. That is a good thing. This is a federalist country. States and localities ought to be the first line of defense against this sort of stuff. And not every state and not every locality ought to be treated exactly the same when it comes to COVID restrictions. Good for Trump on that score. So we are going through President Trump's accomplishments in his first term in office. We've gone through his domestic policy. Now it's time to get to the even better stuff that he's done, which is his foreign policy. Trump's foreign policy has been excellent, like really, really good. I understand that people thought that Trump was going to be a disaster on foreign policy. And there are areas of foreign policy where I really disagree with Trump's approach, particularly North Korea. I don't think that whining and dining Kim Jong-un and writing love letters or anything like that is good foreign policy. However, on everything else, he's been much, much stronger than Barack Obama. Barack Obama wanted to reduce the military. It's why he insisted on trillion-dollar cuts to the military in the middle of sequestration. He insisted that the military be cut down to the bare bones. He insisted on making it so that our Our military was incapable of fighting a two-front conflict. And Donald Trump has rebuilt the military. We have sunk enormous sums of cash into rebuilding the military. At the same time, he's actually created unprecedented peace and prosperity in regions that have not seen it in quite a while. So his most obvious accomplishments have been in the Middle East. So on a personal level, I have great appreciation as a Jew for the fact that Donald Trump moved the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That was something that people had suggested they were going to do for decades. Congress had approved it. Trump actually did it. Trump, in doing that, bucked decades of conventional foreign policy wisdom that said that the Arab street was going to rise en masse, that Arabs cared everywhere about where the United States placed its embassy, that by legitimizing the Jewish claim to Jerusalem, this was somehow a violation of all peaceful norms and was going to lead to wild violence in the streets. None of that happened. Trump recognized the truth. Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel. It will remain the undivided capital of Israel. And the United States doesn't get to decide where Israel has its capital. Israel gets to decide where it has its capital. But it didn't stop there. This was actually the beginning point of a breakout of peace in the Middle East that we have not seen in several decades. It actually was. Okay, so here was what happened. Donald Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Nothing happened. Donald Trump recognized that the Golan Heights were sovereign Israeli territory. They were not disputed territory. They were not owned by the Assad regime in Syria. Nothing happened. Donald Trump recognized that the settlements in Judea and Samaria, the so-called settlements in the West Bank, were not de facto illegal under international law, which of course is true. Nothing happened. And it became obvious to everyone that the Arab nations are not primarily concerned with bolstering the warful aspirations of the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. That the terrorist leadership of the Palestinians had not wanted to make peace, that all of their goals on peace had nothing to do with territory. It had nothing to do with actually achieving a Palestinian state. It was all directed at violence. It was directed at violence against Israel and the destruction of the state of Israel. And the Arab nations had more to gain through peace with Israel than by continuing to back the violence of the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority. And that became absolutely clear when nothing happened. And the next step was a peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, followed by a peace agreement between Israel and Sudan, and a peace agreement between Israel and Kosovo. I mean, there are peace agreements all over the Middle East now, right? There are peace agreements that are happening, Bahrain, that are happening all over the Middle East right now. And the reason that that stuff is happening, and more are coming, Morocco is on the docket, Saudi Arabia is on the docket. The reason that is happening is because Donald Trump had the balls, frankly speaking, to dump over conventional foreign policy wisdom suggesting that the centrality of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, that only if Israel made concessions to the terrorist Palestinian leadership would peace break out in the Middle East. Until then, the Arab nations would remain in a state of constant war with Israel, and they would continue to oppose the United States. Turns out that's not true. It turns out that Donald Trump's willingness to buck conventional foreign policy wisdom was wisdom. It was smart. It was correct. He hasn't gotten proper credit for that. He should get proper credit for that. It is also true, by the way, that his willingness to express that what the Middle East is not a quote-unquote honest broker between a westernized liberal country like Israel and terrorists like the Palestinian Authority. What is necessary is for the West to overtly side with its allies and say, these are our allies and we will back them. And if you would like us to back you too, if you would like us to provide you with all of the tender mercies that the West can offer, then perhaps you should get on board. Also, worth noting, this was the unintentional side effect and consequence of Barack Obama's garbage foreign policy elevating Iran to a status of a regional power. It turns out that when you elevate the mullahs, everybody who is on the mullahs' hit list is going to side with Israel against the mullahs. Here was Donald Trump announcing some of these peace deals.
After 49 years, Israel and the United Arab Emirates will fully normalize their diplomatic relations. They will exchange embassies and ambassadors and begin cooperation across the board by uniting two of America's closest and most capable partners in the region, something which said could not be done. This deal is a significant step towards building a more peaceful, secure, and prosperous Middle East.
Okay, so that was obviously a historic moment. He's not gotten proper credit for that. If Barack Obama had done it, he would have won his second Nobel Prize, given that he won one just for breathing and being a human. Okay, so that was actually an accomplishment. That is a major, major thing. These are the first major peace deals in the region in 30 years. Certainly since 1994 and the Jordanian peace deal. Okay, but frankly, I think these are just as important, if not more important, because it's full normalization. It's recognition of Israel's right to exist. It's full normalization. That's a different thing than Jordan simply saying we're not going to exist in a constant state of open warfare with our neighbors. Okay, meanwhile, he cracked down on Iran. Right? He dumped out of the idiotic Iran deal. The Iran deal was a lie that was foisted on the American people by the Obama administration. The lie was there were moderates in Iran who would be emboldened if the United States signed over billions of dollars and opened the gates to hundreds of billions of dollars in commerce to an Iranian terrorist regime that supported the murder of American soldiers in Iraq, supported the full-scale destruction of the state of Israel, supported the overthrow of the Saudi regime. Right? The Obama administration said, you can use that money for terrorism, fine. Just promise us that you're not going to develop nukes for 10 years. Okay, that is not a deal. That is a surrender. Trump dumped out of it. It set the stage for sanctions on Iran. It set the stage for the weakening of the Iranian regime, and it set the stage for an actual alliance against Iran that included both Jews and Arabs. This is Trump dumping out of the Iran deal in May of 2018.
In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapons. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. Today's action sends a critical message. The United States no longer makes empty threats.
Okay, well, that was a very good thing. And it turned out the United States did not make empty threats. Trump made, again, the ballsy move of killing Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani was in Iraq. He was fostering violence against American troops and against American bases in Iraq. He was not in Iran. He was the head of Iran's terror apparatus, and Trump killed him. And Trump unleashed a Hellfire missile, and Soleimani ended up in pieces. That was a ballsy call. Joe Biden opposed it. Donald Trump is responsible for the killing of al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS in the Middle East. After the Obama administration turned ISIS from the so-called JV team, that's how Obama described them, into an actual regional power. I mean, they controlled territory larger than the size of the UK. The Obama administration started to fight back. The Trump administration radically accelerated that. And then, of course, Trump killed al-Baghdadi, and ISIS was reduced to rubble. And so all of that's in the Middle East. That was all good Middle Eastern policy from President Trump. Furthermore, President Trump recognized China as a threat. So the Bush administration, the Obama administration, all of them treated China as basically a competitor, a strategic competitor, but not a threat. Right? They weren't people who were really out to subvert democracy. They weren't people who were out to maximize their own power at the cost of the West. They weren't folks who were attempting to exacerbate their own regional influence through pure intimidation. But Trump recognized exactly what it was that China was doing. China has been exploiting trade rules in order to enrich itself. It's been cheating. China has been radically expanding its military presence in the South China Sea. And Trump recognized that, and Trump decided that it was time to actually strike back at Chinese economic source of power.
We must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world, China. In the earliest days of the virus, China locked down travel domestically while allowing flights to leave China and infect the world. Later, they falsely said people without symptoms would not spread the disease. The United Nations must hold China accountable for their actions.
Okay, so good for him, because China is a bad actor on the world stage. I mean, it is incredible that we have watched in the last several years China overtly take over a democratic Hong Kong. Like literally just take it over, walk right in and take it over. And the rest of the world did nothing. What do you think Joe Biden is going to do? You think Joe Biden is going to stand up strong to the Chinese? He can't even declare that China is an enemy. He says they're not even a competitor, by the way. He says that the chances that they eat our lunch are nil. Meanwhile, China is already fostering parties inside Taiwan in an attempt to get Taiwan to overthrow its own democratically elected government. Now, China is on the march, and Trump at least gets that much. Meanwhile, Trump also dumped out of the idiotic Paris Accords. The Paris Accords were set to crumble the American economy like a piece of Kleenex. The Paris Accords would not alleviate climate change in any serious way. Even if all nations abided by the Paris Accords, it would marginally lower the temperature over the course of the next century from its prospective warmth. The Paris Accords were not being abided by India. They were not being abided by China. Trump dumped out of them because they are, in fact, stupid. The Paris Accords are a piece of paper in which a bunch of countries pretend that they're going to reduce their carbon emissions while not reducing their carbon emissions. And they've been held up by Democrats as some sort of grand foreign policy achievement. They are not. They were an excuse to cut down on America's oil industry and her fracking industry and her manufacturing. Here was President Trump talking about dumping out of the Paris Accords.
The Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States to the exclusive benefit of other countries. leaving American workers, who I love, and taxpayers to absorb the cost in terms of lost jobs, lower wages, shuttered factories, and vastly diminished economic production.
And he is correct about this. Okay, and the left went nuts over it. And the fact is, again, the Paris Accords were completely useless. They were an empty piece of paper. They were a big nothing. And then the left says, oh, well, it's so bad that he got out of it. Okay, on foreign policy, I think it is also worth noting that Donald Trump has not started any new wars. Isn't that kind of a thing? I mean, there's not been a president in my lifetime who hasn't started any new wars. The war in Yugoslavia was a Clinton war. Putting troops on the ground in Somalia, that was a Clinton war. George W. Bush, of course, did not start the war in Afghanistan. That was a response to 9/11. The war in Iraq was a Bush administration move. The Obama administration fought an unconstitutional war in Libya, right, where America had essentially no foreign policy interest whatsoever. And of course, he pursued a massive drone campaign that was firmly ignored by the left for years on end. The fact that Trump has not started any new wars is kind of an accomplishment, is it not? I know that we ignore all of that. But for a guy who's supposed to be a tyrannical warmonger, he doesn't seem like all that much of a tyrant or a warmonger. It's just something I'm noticing. Trump has actually lessened the amount of control the federal government exerts over your life domestically. And he has lessened America's reliance on war making on foreign policy. So I'm wondering, he was supposed to be Hitlerian. I'm wondering where the record of that is. Like, seriously, none of this is deny. He says dumb crap. President says dumb crap. Fact. Also, he has not been a warmonger. He's brought an enormous amount of good to the Middle East. He has stood up to the Russians. He has stood up to the Chinese. He has done many things that, I'm always amazed by the talk about Russia, by the way. Donald Trump has actually maintained sanctions on Russia. Donald Trump has stood with Eastern Europe against Russian predations. Barack Obama allowed the Russians to march into Crimea with nothing happening. Barack Obama overtly handed over Syria to the Russians. The disconnect between Trump's actual performance and the way that he is covered by the media and by his enemies is extraordinary. Extraordinary. Okay, in just a second, we're going to get to some actual good rhetoric by President Trump, because I think perhaps the largest difference between Trump and his opponents is that on a baseline level, Trump does not believe that America is a bad place. On a baseline level, the Democratic Party has moved in the direction of the 1619 Project. They've moved in the direction of a perceived multiculturalism that suggests that America is no better than any other place. Donald Trump has been a ringing rebuke to that. I don't think that he represents it the best way that it could be represented, but I think that he has had some real high rhetoric moments. I think we ignore those because of the dumb Twitter comments. But it is worth remembering them because in the long run, expression of those values is quite important. So when it comes to Trump's rhetoric, I've been highly critical, and I think justifiably so. I think his tweets have gotten him in a lot of trouble. I think that if they had flushed his phone down the toilet within the first 2 days of his election, Donald Trump would be cruising to re-election right now. I think that he has done himself no favors through his rhetorical excesses, through his inability to control his messaging and all the rest. It is worthy of note that Donald Trump has, from time to time, issued some very important statement on American values. That doesn't mean that Trump himself is necessarily the best representative of those values at all times. It does mean the statements are worthy of note because there is a left on the march in the United States that despises American philosophy, wants to see American statues torn down, believes that America is inherently a racist, terrible place. This is a Democratic Party that full-scale embraces the 1619 Project, which suggests that the true founding of the United States was not in freedom and liberty in 1776. It, in fact, was something very, very different. Okay, so President Trump famously spoke at Mount Rushmore. He gave what I thought was an absolutely unobjectionable speech. Not only unobjectionable, necessary speech, talking about American values and their enduring purpose and principle, and talking about the evils of a disintegrationist philosophy that wishes to tear down the nation on the false basis that America is racist, sexist, bigoted, and homophobic from its roots. Here is Donald Trump at Mount Rushmore in what I think was probably the most important speech of his presidency.
Those who seek to erase our heritage want Americans to forget our pride and our great dignity so that we can no longer understand ourselves or America's destiny. In toppling the heroes of 1776, they seek to dissolve the bonds of love and loyalty that we feel for our country and that we feel for each other. Their goal is not a better America. Their goal is to end America.
He is not wrong about this. And the fact that Trump was willing to speak that out loud is definitely a good thing because the left is on the march. And Joe Biden has been putting out these very patriotic ads, right? It's got all of the stock footage. Right? Oh, look, some waving grain. Oh, look, it's an American flag with the sunlight shining through it. Oh, look, it's a father helping his son at a baseball game. Okay, but let's be real. The heart and soul of the Democratic Party is not with the Joe Biden appeals to patriotism at this point. It is with the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Ilhan Omar and the Rashida Tlaib. It is with the radicals in the Democratic Party who believe that America is not a great place, that America is, in fact, a quite terrible place. And in fact, Joe Biden from time to time has said this. He said, literally, we have never lived up to our ideals. Never in American history have we lived up to our ideals, which is an amazing statement for a country that freed Europe of tyranny twice, for a country that was responsible for ending slavery within its own borders via a massive civil war, for a country that was responsible for a civil rights movement that elevated a victimized racial minority to legally required rights. I mean, that was a righteous crusade. This country has very often lived up to its ideals. But Democrats don't, but here's the thing about that statement. Many Democrats don't even like those ideals. Many Democrats believe the ideals themselves are racist. They are tools of oppression. There's a whole group of woke people in the United States who believe that freedom of the press, freedom of speech, the rights to bear arms, these rights are in and of themselves the threat to you. They are a threat to me. They are a threat to everything good and decent. The Democratic Party is moving in their direction. They would rather make common cause with those folks than defend those core rights. Trump pointing that out is definitely worthwhile. The other speech that President Trump gave that I thought was quite impactful was in 2017. President Trump spoke defending Western civilization in Warsaw. He talked about Russia's destabilizing actions around the world. He praised the Polish resistance. And naturally, the left-wing media immediately declared that this was white nationalism and anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant rhetoric because he talked about the glories of Western civilization. Why? Because Trump said that when he was talking about Western accomplishments, he talked about art and symphonies and all of this stuff. And apparently that's bad. That's very, very bad. You're not allowed to talk about the greatness of Western civilization without the left immediately labeling it white supremacist, which shows the problem with the left. If you hate Western civilization so much that you believe that even its mention is a white supremacist dog whistle, then you should not be trusted with the keys to the car. Here was President Trump talking in defense of Western civilization in Poland in 2017.
Americans, Poles, and nations of Europe value individual freedom and sovereignty. We must work together to confront forces, whether they come from inside or out, from the South or the East, that threaten over time to undermine these values and to erase the bonds of culture, faith, and tradition that make us who we are.
Okay, that is true. It is true. And these are challenges that are going to outlast any election. The challenges to American philosophy, the challenges to Western civilization, these are civilizational challenges. They are going to outlast whatever happens between Joe Biden and Donald Trump next week. It's going to require a re-education of the American public in the foundational principles of America. Not re-education in the Maoist sense, not indoctrination. A reacquaintance with founding principle that has been completely obliterated by a left that sees those foundational principles as bad. The fact that Trump spoke out about them during his presidency is worthy of note. And the fact that his opponents hated them so much is even more worthy of note. If Trump has done nothing else rhetorically, he has certainly clarified where people stand. Trump is like a catalyzing enzyme. He's made everything quite clear. It is now very obvious where a lot of people stand on American founding philosophy, on Western civilization, regardless of whether you think Trump is a good defender of those things. The willingness of so many people to dump over those fundamental basic principles that uphold everything good and the things that we cherish in the United States and abroad because they hate Trump demonstrates that they don't have a lot of fealty to those principles in the first place. Alrighty, we'll be back here tomorrow with much, much more content. 5 days away from Election Day. If you have not yet voted, go do it right now. This is The Ben Shapiro Show.